Evening, everybody. Tonight we're going to start learning how to solve inequalities. I need you to pay specific attention to what happens when we multiply or divide by a negative number. I also want you to take a look at how we specifically check our work, because there's an additional step with the check step. But I think what you'll find is that solving inequalities is much like solving a regular equation, except we need to keep track of the inequality sign and make sure that when we have that special rule that we follow that special rule. So that being said, let's get started and we'll take a look at this. So here you can see a problem that I've already solved, and it's very straightforward. I mean, it's 3 parentheses x plus 2 plus 3x is greater than or equal to 4x minus 2. The thing that I'd like you to take a look at here is that I still simplified, I still isolated my variable, and you can't see the very bottom here, I apologize, but I divided the 2x, and I divided the negative 8, and I end up with x is greater than or equal to negative 4. Everything that you've learned up until this point is exactly the same in this particular problem. You simplified, you isolate, and you divide the coefficient in order to get an x. But in this case, it was a greater than or equals to sign. So common mistakes that I see is that people drop the equal portion of the greater than or equal to. Even crazier sometimes, I see this get reversed. Be careful when you do that. Make sure that if you do that, it's for a reason and not just because you're losing track of things. So I hope that you, as you look at this, you go, okay, so solving inequalities is pretty straightforward, so why do I even have a lesson on this? Well, let's take a look at an example of why you have a lesson. Well, here we have negative 3x is greater than or equal to 6. So everything's been done except for dividing by the coefficient. So I divide by negative 3, and I get x, and I get negative 2, and I just change the sign. Very important concept, number 1 for tonight. I flipped the sign. Well, why did you do that, Mr. Lawrence? Well, let's take a look at an example here. 2, I think you'd all agree, is greater than negative 3. Okay? I'd rather have $2 than $3. If I multiply this number by, let's say, negative 2, what I do on one side, I do on the other. So that should be perfectly legal. I get negative 4, and I get negative 2 times negative 3 is 6. Would it be still fair to say that negative 4 is now greater than 6? Well, hopefully you'll say no to that. You'll see that it is a switch, that now negative 4 is less than 6. So we multiplied both sides by the same value, but the inequality had to be flipped. Now that not only works for multiplication, but also works for division of a negative number. Let's divide both sides by negative 2. Now I end up with negative 1, and I end up with 2. I don't think there's anybody here who'd say that negative 1 is greater than 2. Again, we have to flip the sign. So very important concept number 1. When we multiply or divide by a negative, we flip the sign, or we flip the inequality. And don't forget that. In fact, you might want to write it up at the top of your page every time. Flip the inequality if negative. Okay? Something like that. Anything to remind yourself as you go through the problems. Because if you don't, you're going to be upset. Now, there is a way to check our work. So here we had negative 3x is greater than 6. We have negative 3x is greater than 6. We divide by negative 3, divide by negative 3. We get x is now less than 2. Okay? Well, how do you check step this? Well, the first thing we do is we check to make sure that this number is correct. So we do negative 3 times 2 equals 6. Oops, I'm sorry, that's a negative. Sorry about that. Negative, okay. Negative times a negative is a positive. Positive 6 equals 6. And then you can actually see a great example. I forgot the negative and I caught my mistake when I went to do the check step. Okay, so I have negative 2, 6 equals 6. I know that my value is correct. Well, how do I know that my inequality sign is going in the right direction? We'll pick a number less than negative 2. I like big even numbers like 10, negative 10. So let's go back. We have negative 3 times negative 10, because negative 10 is certainly less than negative 2. Always going back into the original equation, greater than 6. Negative 3 times negative 10 is 30. 30 is greater than 6. I now know that my inequality sign is going in the right direction. Okay? In class, remind me to ask you about choosing 0. Choosing 0 to check the inequality. I'll show you a technique where you can always choose 0, but I'd like to do that in person. All right, so ask me in class about choosing 0. All right, so let's take a look at another example here. We have 2x plus 6, 3x minus 2. Now I know in past I've told you that you might want to subtract the smaller number. Okay, and if we do that, we have 2x here minus 2x here, and I end up with a nice positive x. What happens if you decide that you don't like to do that? Let's say you subtract 3x over here, and you subtract 3x over here. Well, now I end up with a negative x. If I end up with a negative x, I have my plus 6 greater than or equal to negative 2. I'm going to subtract 6 from both sides. I have negative x greater than or equal to negative 8. But now I have to get rid of the negative. I'm going to divide by negative 1. This becomes x. This becomes 8. But what happens to my sign? I have to flip it. Okay? So you could do it that way. Or the opposite way would be to get rid of the 2x, and I would have 6 is greater than or equal to x minus 2. I can add 2 to both sides, and now I have 8 is greater than or equal to x, and I can just rewrite this, x is less than or equal to 8. I think if you're being honest with yourselves and you look at this, that you'll say that this side is a lot easier to deal with than this side. There is a lot more negatives going on over here than on this side. If I get rid of the largest negative, or I get rid of the smallest x value and keep my x positive, it makes my life a lot easier. Okay? Check step. How do I do check step? Well, my value is 8, so it's 2 times 8 plus 6 equals 3 times 8. I'm just going to write 24 for you there. Minus 2. 2 times 8 is 16 plus 6 equals 22. 22 equals 22. X is less than 8. I love this. Why? Because pick a number less than 8. 0. 0 is definitely less than 8. So 2 times 0 is 0 plus 6 greater than 3 times 0 is 0. Negative 2. Is 6 greater than negative 2? Yes. So that's correct, and that's correct. And I think that's, I kind of already gone over the 0 there, but when it's definitely, the number is less than 0, choose it every single, unless, if 0 is less than a number, choose it every single time. It'll make your life so easy to do the check step to make sure your inequality is going in the right direction. Okay, one last thing here. We've got a negative and a 6 at the bottom. How do I get that 6 out of there? Well, we've talked about multiplying. Multiply this by negative 6. Multiply this by negative 6. A negative times a negative gives me a positive, so that's x. That gives me negative 12. I multiplied by a negative number, so I have to flip the sign. And then again, I would do the check step. Not a big deal. Pick a number less than negative 12, negative 20 most probably a good number, although I always like to choose numbers that are multiples of my denominator. In this case, multiple of 6 is 18, so I choose negative 18. Negative 18 divided by negative 6 is greater than or equal to 2. 6 goes into 18 3 times. Negative divided by a negative is a positive. 3 is greater than or equal to 2. Good check step there. All right. Well, I hope this makes sense. Make sure that you understand the very important concept number 1, multiplying or dividing by a negative. Make sure you know how to not only do the check step for the value, but the check step for the inequality.